city level to, drop speed limits or put speed limiters on some vehicles, that kind of thing?
I'll let Eric and DOT talk about speed limits since that's their bailiwick. But one of the things that we're doing on the fleet side, and we're seeing more and more fleets do this, we're monitoring the speed of all vehicles. So we have actually, New York City operates the largest telematics, what's called Telematics live tracking initiative in the United States with 23,000 fleet units that are monitored for speed, for hard braking, for hard accelerating, for turns, for crashes. So it really allows us to understand what's happening really minute by minute in terms of driving behavior and try and change driving behavior before you get to crashes and before you get to these terrible incidents. One of the things we know is that rear ending is, one of the major reasons we have collisions involving injuries. And New York City spends a lot of money on litigation, even with just our city fleet. Rear ending is something that through training should really never happen, and also through technology, through automatic braking. And you might get to automation later, but automatic braking, you don't need full automated cars, just put automated braking in all our vehicles. So that actually really can help on the kind of behavioral side. One other thing I'll mention is we absolutely have seen, and you talk about the impacts of COVID-19, an unexpected maybe impact was the driving habits in the city and nationally, and we're able to look at this, and in the city fleet, frankly, declined during the 6 months, from April through October. I think at least we've seen some things getting better. But you saw something that you wouldn't necessarily connect with COVID-19, the pandemic per se, but there's absolutely no question the roads became less safe, even though in many cases they were less crowded. And so driving habits, safety, speeding increased, carelessness increased, distraction increased. So a kind of an unexpected impact for COVID.
Thank you. And to you, Frank, I mean, I know that, Revels do have speed limiters. I think the scooters can go up to 27 miles per hour. Can you just give me the conversation around that, whether there was a push to make them faster, slower, whatever?
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why Revel really works for a city like New York, is that they are speed limited to 30 miles an hour. So even if you are holding down that throttle for a minute straight, it's not going to go above 30 miles an hour. I think it just brings up, another point here about, when you think of speed limits, especially for cars, I live here in Crown Heights, right near Atlantic Avenue. I can tell you right now, when I'm walking along Atlantic Avenue, there are plenty of cars going 40, 50, 60 miles an hour sometimes. So clearly, when you think of vulnerable roadway users, you're thinking anybody on two wheels, whether it's a motorcyclist, whether it's a moped or a bike, right? When you have a multi-ton vehicle going way above the speed limit. I think when you talk about how do you fix that, what do we do to make sure that whether 25 miles an hour should be reduced or not, but at least people just reducing speeding in general. I think that's where you go back to infrastructure and potentially street design. Should there really be any two-lane roads in, boroughs like Brooklyn or Queens? Should we be, changing street design to just naturally cars are going to go slower in a design like that? So I think, when you talk longer term, I think that's probably the direction the city should go instead of just more, let's say, enforcement, because that's just really hard to do, especially in an equitable way. But I think when you talk about infrastructure and street design, I think that's really where you start to tackle the speeding problem.
Thank you. And I'll turn to Eric for that. I mean, obviously, it's cheaper to just slap up some new metal signs than to, redesign streets around the city. But is that the preferred method? What's happening at the DOT level?
Sure. And something that we know for sure on the safety front is speed kills. Like when speeds around the city get high, as Keith said, like that's when we see fatalities happening on streets. And we need to do everything we can to make sure that speeds stay at a reasonable level, both to make sure that people aren't getting in crashes, and if a crash should happen, you are much more likely to survive at 20 more miles an hour than you are at 30. It's just a world of difference. And we need to use all the tools in our toolbox. The city clearly did get a big boost when it went to the 25 mile an hour speed limit from 30. And some of that comes from putting up the signs. I think a lot of it came from the public education campaign as well, where I think most people didn't even know that the city had a 30-mile-an-hour speed limit, and we did a lot of work to try to educate around that. So I think there is value to the citywide limit, but then as Frank said, it goes far beyond that as well. We're actively working to make sure that we're redesigning our streets, especially focusing on the most dangerous ones. That our big streets are the ones where crashes and fatalities are much more likely to happen. So you don't need to redesign every street. You need to redesign the ones that have the highest speeds and the highest crash rates. But at the same time, we do feel like enforcement is part of the picture. And one of the things that DOT spent a tremendous amount of effort on over the summer is expanding our speed camera program. Because we agree it's very hard to have the police department out enforcing speeds on our streets. Even leaving aside, there's obviously a host of equity issues there. But even just physically catching someone who's speeding on a city street involves someone driving even faster to try to catch them, which is not necessarily what we want to see. But we now have speed cameras in all 750 school zones that are authorized by state law, and we continued adding speed cameras, doubling up in those zones. And what a camera does is it catches everyone and it catches them equally. That if you are speeding, and per state law, if you're speeding more than 10 miles an hour over the speed limit, you are going to get a ticket. And we've seen consistently that when we put these cameras up, speeding declines in those areas. And that doesn't mean we're catching everyone everywhere. Certainly overnight in particular has been a huge problem, which is not a time that we can always enforce with the speed cameras. We are limited by state law, but we think that that's something we can pair with good street design, is having equitable automated enforcement to help keep speeds under control.
I definitely want to turn to the council member for this one. If we're talking about, who is in, moving traffic enforcement outside of the realm of the NYPD. There's been some discussion of that lately. But of course, we do have to acknowledge that putting in traffic cameras is controversial. Drivers don't like them. So, Councilmember, what's the conversation on the legislative level there? Could traffic enforcement be pulled away from the NYPD, and are cameras an option? More cameras?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that I agree that we can look at certain places in order to improve them. I think overall, like, our street design does have to change. I do think that we've been building a city for cars for a very long time, and that first and foremost, we should focus on pedestrians. And I think there are a lot of opportunities to redesign the street. Now, you mentioned Paris. And when I think of safe streets and the kind of future I want for our city, I know that I often look to European cities where there are multiple types of active transportation, often peacefully coexisting with transit and with other types of vehicles. And I think the answer is like overwhelmingly simple. I think there's laws, there's statutes, there's ordinances that they may not be effective at changing behavior, but that better street design to eliminate the need for such behavior altogether is the way to go. I think if we invest in safer streets, we can have shared community spaces that effectively police themselves. I do think that the cameras, the enforcement cameras are important. We did that with the busway. We had the busway between 3rd and 9th Avenue. It's a transit and truck priority corridor for the majority of the day. And so we were able to put in, we gave people kind of a grace period to get used to it, because we realized that pilot programs really should allow that sort of accommodation. And then what we did was, once the cameras were up and running, there were the 60-day violations. That was the grace period, and that passed. And we found the automated approach to be much more effective at improving driver behavior and ensuring that all safety measures were taken. So I know that maybe drivers don't like it, but we have slow zones in my district, and there are slow zones across the city. I thought when we went into the pandemic that we probably should have done a citywide slow zone. I just thought it was a lot for us to change and evolve so quickly. And then, just our sight and our line of sight and our vision, everything was being challenged. So I thought that was a missed opportunity, but I do think as we're looking in, does the slow zone work? It certainly works in my district. I'm sure it works in other places. And I think that open streets and other kind of ideas and initiatives, that's where maybe DOT can do more programming and experimentation. And that's other agencies too, not just DOT. I think cities in other areas, they pilot materials for bike lanes all the time, and just to test out what works and what doesn't. And I think that's really the way to go forward.
And for the slow zones, I mean, is that police officers there monitoring, or is it just about putting down, the wooden blockades in the right places? And
we just have like big signs. We have it like painted on the streets. I do notice a difference. I think it works. I'm sure there's some data out there to say whether or not it does. I think people just knowing what the speed limit is, people might say, oh, it's 30 everywhere. It's not necessarily. So just making sure that people are able to understand. I think there is a very big educational component to this, but in other countries, they do this, like in terms of Revel, like in Indonesia, they have Uber, like an Uber scooter. It's called Gojek. So I don't think we're maybe quite there, but there certainly is a path to get to a place where we're more innovative. And I think we can use more of those sustainable, greener forms of transportation and not such a heavy reliance on big cars.
With us talking about enforcement, I do want to bring it to Revel again. And Frank, I mean, first of all, just the fact that because the scooter sharing is app-based, you can do a little bit of enforcement remotely, right? I mean, where the scooters are at all times. Can you explain that? And has that been working, or does there need to be further enforcement when it comes to either police officers, cameras, that sort of thing?
Well, I think even before you get to enforcement, when it comes to two-wheeled micromobility, like a moped, I think it starts with training as well. So something that Revel did when we relaunched at the end of the summer here in New York is every single rider, the hundreds of thousands of users that we have here, as well as every single other market that we're in, you have to go through a 42-question safety training before you're able to ride again. So I think before you even get to enforcement, whether you're talking about mopeds, whether you're talking about e-bikes, whether you're talking about electric kick scooters, I think there's a level of training and education for the user that's really important. And then I also think, as you alluded to, accountability. Because I think that relates to enforcement, right? So accountability for something like Revel is, besides it being state law, you need to wear a helmet, besides us providing 2 helmets at every single Revel since we launched in 2018, every single time you ride now, you have to take a photo with that helmet strapped on your head and prove to us that you're wearing it every single time you ride. Jeff, we were talking, I know you're a user of Revel, and you were mentioning sort of going through the safety training and going through the helmet selfie and having to do that every single time you ride now. And then again, the enforcement accountability side is not allowing that picture to just go into a black box and never look at it, right? Every single one is looked at. And since we've relaunched, unfortunately, some people didn't take it seriously enough, and we've had to permanently suspend several thousand paying customers, right? Talk about accountability and enforcement, a company doing that to themselves. So I think all of that is related. And I think any other forms of micromobility companies that operate in New York, I would suggest they take the same level of accountability for themselves when they come here, if they do.
That kind of internal enforcement and accountability makes me think of the New York City fleet. Keith, if you could tell us briefly, I mean, you manage like thousands of city government drivers in different cars, that sort of thing. What kind of enforcement is there internally? Do you know where the cars are at all times? Do people have to take seatbelt selfies, that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, we have over 80,000 fleet operators, and of course, an incredible wide section of services that we provide, from policing to parks. So a few things. What we do as part of Vision Zero is, DOT redesigns the streets, police enforce. What we're really trying to do is 2 things. One, redesign the vehicle to the extent we can. And to some extent, you can redesign and change over and switch over vehicles and trucks more quickly than you can redesign all the streets. The second is education. So in the redesign of the vehicle, we're installing the telematics, like I mentioned earlier. We're tracking. We're putting in automatic braking where we can. We have the North America's leading side guard initiative, and we're at 80%. And we want to see every truck have a side guard in America. In Europe, that's true today. In America, it's almost never seen. And we talked about that last time I was with you. We're trying to get high vision trucks, design trucks so that that cab, the engine is not in front of the driver, blocking the driver's view. And there are high vision trucks, so you can see the ground. And we are going to buy high vision trucks wherever we can. And we're just launching now a surround camera initiative. So where we can, our drivers have the best view they can. The second part is training. We just brought our safe defensive driver training online. We've trained 65,000 employees in how to drive safely, and that is mandatory. And then we work with agencies to enforce. And not everybody out there enjoys this, but there are live, every time you're going too fast in New York City, you're getting a live ping. Right? We're literally sending you and your boss an email that says, you're speeding at the moment, or you just took an incredibly sharp turn, or you just slammed the brakes. Was there some reason for that? What's interesting is that along with speeding, hard braking is a tremendous indicator of potentially unsafe driving behaviors, right? If you hard brake once, a cat ran in front of your car, so be it, right? That's a good thing. But if you're constantly having to slam the brakes, or the alternative, floor the accelerator in a car, that means you are an unsafe driver. You're either a speeder or rear ender, or you just don't know where you are or where you're going. So we are doing alerts and reporting, speed indexes, to try and, we aren't here to do discipline, right? We're not trying to discipline employees. It's not our point. We want to safeguard employees and safeguard pedestrians, right? In every collision, the driver, who's a city employee, is just as likely to be hurt, injured, or killed as somebody out in the street. We want to safeguard everybody. So we work with agencies where we have to on discipline and other issues, but that's really an agency focus. Our focus is changing behaviors and getting a safer fleet out there for everybody.
I am glad that I'm not a city driver. That feels like a lot of pressure, but I'm sure they're the best in the business. So that's good to hear. I want to bring it back to open streets briefly. We were talking about it before. And look, winter is coming. I know some of the most popular open streets we saw like Vanderbilt and Prospect Heights, West End on the Upper West Side. They've kind of been shutting down for the winter. Council member, to you, I mean, are there plans? Do we expect all the open streets to open up again in the spring? And I guess also for Eric, I'm sure the DOT has some involvement here.
Well, like I said, I'm clearly, I introduced the bill. At first, the mayor wasn't really interested in supporting it. We had a very long hearing. Lots of people testified in support. Of course, people always bring up concerns, right? It's always, every single initiative and project has room for improvement. And then eventually they came around. So we do have a number of great examples that you just mentioned. I think in the spring, absolutely, it should be a regular thing in New York City, and it should become a permanent fixture. It's not going to work in every district in the council. It's not going to work in every neighborhood. These are for places that people can't walk to a park. And so we've seen in Queens where this has worked. Of course, there are some areas where they're really not feeling it, and that's all right too. I think though, where it has been successful, you've seen it is very diverse in kind of age and background. I do think as we work towards more communities in terms of equity, and as I mentioned, those kind of historically disenfranchised communities, making sure that they're at the table when we make these decisions. Like I said, it's been really critical for restaurants, bars, small business owners to take advantage of that space. And I think even for that alone, it's been something that's been a real benefit to the community. So since the program started, like I said, I've called on Department of Transportation and the mayor so we can work together to make streets safer. I'm calling for the passage of my bill, the creation of permanent open streets program. I'm working to amend the bill as we speak, which is laid over in committee. And I'm hoping that with community boards, with bids, with all of the stakeholders who have been instrumental in its success thus far, that we'll continue the conversation and hopefully make it a permanent thing as soon as possible.
Yeah, and we really appreciate all that. And I think there's been a lot of really great local leadership, including by the council member and others, that have really helped push the city in a very good direction here, and have also been very good at working with us around what's been working and what hasn't. When we first started Open Streets, there was a thought of like, maybe we need to do this near parks because playgrounds were closed and people didn't have access. And I think as the pandemic has gone on, we've learned some things about maybe that the parks have actually been sort of okay. That wasn't the most important place to do them, but we do want to make sure we're doing them in places that lack parks and like really need that open space. And we see that that's really where they're being well used. And I think one of the lessons we've very much learned is that these are much more successful when we have a strong local partner as well. That we just, as by the nature of bureaucratic city government, like we're not going to be all places at all times. But when there's someone who we can partner with, they can sort of make sure that the street is being actively used, that barriers are being put out, but also that if a fire truck or an ambulance or a important delivery needs to get through, that there's a way to do that. And we've developed through this a number of really great local partners, including on the side on the Lower East Side. But I think the council member gets at one other really important thing that we're working through, which is how do we make sure that those partners exist in lower income communities and places of greater need, where there's maybe a little less social capital and a little less of the naturally existing groups. And I think that that's something we feel very strongly about as a city and as a department, is how do we make sure that we're providing these benefits equitably and not only going where there's a loud advocacy community or an already well-functioning community group, but how can we build those up? I think we have a history of doing that with pedestrian plazas, where under the prior administration, plazas really only happened in sort of wealthier areas, and the de Blasio administration created the Plaza Equity Program and put real money into not just giving money directly to organizations, but like really building capacity and providing training and working with these groups. And as a result, I think we have many more very well high-functioning community spaces in low-income neighborhoods around the city. And as we think about expanding open streets, we want to think about how we can bring that same model, which of course is a challenge in a time of diminished resources. But we think that that's really the right way to do it, is to make sure we're building those partnerships and building both in terms of outreach, but also in terms of actually building capacity. I think that's a lot of the discussion that we're going to be having over the winter, is both how can we take the ones that are really going well and how can we strengthen them, but also how do we keep building those relationships all over the city wherever it's really needed.
Thank you. Now, I want to hit a couple more topics before I go to the audience Q&A. And I'm thinking about alternatives to driving. We've been discussing a lot of how people get around, of course. I don't think we've really touched upon delivery trucks yet. There's also been a lot of discussion about, first of all, just, the dangerous driving that's involved in large trucks, and how to find alternatives to those, whether it's more, bicycles with big storage on them, or much smaller trucks like we see in many other countries. So this is a really question for anybody who can speak to this. Is this something that New York needs to look into and be concerned with, or is, alternatives to delivery trucks just more of a national problem, something that the city can't really do?
No, I think we certainly have to do something about it. There is such a great opportunity here now that we're talking about cycling infrastructure. And I think, of course, that needs to be expanded, and there has to be a real holistic, comprehensive network. And I think that micro hauling is certainly something we should do. And those delivery bikes, whether they're, electric or not, is certainly something we're already seeing. And you see it with Amazon and Whole Foods, but we can also use it for things like moving compost. I mean, there are a lot of opportunities there in organizations that have started this work. We just have to help them expand. And so in front of here in the Lower East Side, we have a Whole Foods on like the Bowery in Houston. And so the delivery workers, they pretty much line up all in front of the supermarket. And so what we're going to do is to take that opportunity and really put a space where they could actually load their bikes to make it safer for them, because that's just a part of our new reality. They're going to continue to deliver. So I think those sorts of loading zones is also something we're bringing to Avenue C as we're creating this alternative bikeway, protected bike lanes on Avenue C. And we're looking at how we can do loading and unloading there for the supermarkets. And to be honest, we get these huge like beer trucks for all of the bars and the restaurants and the supermarkets, and they take up a lot of space on the street. So I think it has to be a conversation, right? That's very, very inclusive, and where we're looking at how do we make those vehicles much smaller, which is much safer for these very highly residential places, but then also pivot towards like the greener, accommodating the greener sort of deliveries.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we've seen during COVID is to say how important deliveries are for all of us, and how much they've changed. You know, in working with the trucking association, we found that you know, previously about 40% of deliveries were happening at residences, and during the time of COVID, that's about double. Almost 80% of deliveries are happening at residential locations. And like, these trucks are here. We frankly rely on them. Like, I challenge how many people on this webinar haven't gotten a package this week of some sort. It's part of how New York City functions now, and we have to make sure we're doing it sustainably. And that, you know, that means, as the council member said, finding ways to encourage cargo bikes. We started a program about a year ago and have since doubled the number of cargo bikes operating in the city. We want to keep doing that, providing space, providing encouragement. But it also means that trucks are still going to be a part of the vehicle mix, and we want to make sure that they can get to their destinations and do that safely. So we want to provide spaces for them to load and unload so that they're not blocking traffic or blocking bus or bike lanes. We've done that through our neighborhood loading zone program that we're going to keep working on. But we also want to make sure that they do it safely, that we're as Keith has said, you know, really looking at technology and making sure that New York City is a leader in you know, whether it's side guards, whether it's cameras. Like, we want to make sure that we are building a sustainable freight thing, because freight is the thing that's often hardest to mode shift, and we want to make sure that if it's happening in the most sustainable and the safest way possible.
Yeah, I mean, if I can follow up on what Eric said, I mean, two things. One, it's a reminder that there are so many industries that we may have taken for granted who are really essential, right? You know, forget the stock market. It's the food market that's essential. That's where I actually eat. And it's transportation and fleets who are essential employees, right? You know, in many ways, our entire market structure now is go online and then have a truck deliver it, right? You know, it's changing how we shop and how we think about interacting. So, and it's the employees, the drivers, the truck drivers, the cab drivers who are essential employees in providing these services. You know, there's only so much we can do as a fleet. We downsize where we can, but we're a big fleet. We got garbage trucks and ambulances and ESU, emergency response vehicles. But what we are trying to be is not just the safest, but the most sustainable emissions. And we really view sustainability as emissions and safety. It's all one thing. And there is a lot of really good and interesting progress. New York City operates 2,700 electric vehicles. We have over 1,000 charging stations now. Both of those are the largest programs in New York State. But there's a lot of really positive development on the electrification side and the hybrid side. You may have heard that we're going to all hybrid police cars in New York City, and it's a nice CBS story about that in the last couple of days. And that's going to have really great maintenance and emissions and cost implications. Later on, we will go to all electric. But we're also seeing announcements in the industry, all electric cargo vans. We operate on behalf of all of you, 5,000 of those vans. All electric pickup trucks. We operate another 2,500 of those. We just brought out, the Department of Sanitation is now testing its first all-electric garbage truck. And so a lot is happening on the electrification side in that industry. At the same time, there are, for where you have to use diesel fuel, there are advanced biofuels like renewable diesel and biodiesel that could allow for the full switch out of fossil fuel. And we're supporting the low carbon fuel standard discussion in New York State. California has a low carbon fuel standard. We'd love to see that here in New York State. If we could get a large supply of renewable diesel, biofuel at a reasonable cost, like exists in California, we could stop as a city government using all diesel fuel for all heating and all vehicles tomorrow. So this kind of technology is really developing. It's moving forward. Whatever this federal administration thought it was doing to try and stop it really didn't happen some ways, but the industry is moving forward. So there's really a lot of positive things that are happening and out there on the sustainable side. So where you have to have vehicles, having them be safe and then having them reduce emissions.
And Keith, I've got to ask about, electrification. You're making me think of the probably the most famous city vehicle, Bill de Blasio's minivan, the one that drives him around the city from place to place. I just want to be clear: is that a plug-in hybrid? Is it an electrical vehicle? What are we dealing with there?
Yep, it's a plug-in. It's a plug-in hybrid. It's an electric vehicle. It's a Pacifica minivan, made in America, and we have charging at Gracie Mansion and at City Hall, and that is mostly charged up. You have what are called PHEVs, plug-in hybrids, that have small gas tanks. So if you are in a situation, if there was an emergency situation and you needed to go more miles than you normally do, or if you're taking a longer trip, you have that gas backup. But most of the miles are on electric. You have the 2 charging stations, and yes, that is vehicle number 1 for us, and it's a plug-in vehicle.
I'm glad. I always think there's always these trolls on Twitter who say, de Blasio's SUV spewing fumes, and I say, hey, wait a second, you can criticize him for other things, but it's not an
SUV. It's a plug-in hybrid electric minivan.
Thank you. I'm glad we can set the record straight. I do want to turn to a question from the Q&A. Talk about uprooting car culture. I guess specifically there, it's how can the city be more focused on actively discouraging car ownership and car usage? We obviously touched a little bit about it there, but this is a broader topic. There's often discussions of how to make driving more safe, but some people will say that the safest driving is not driving at all. So I'll open that up to the whole panel here. If anybody has thoughts on how and if the city should be discouraging car usage at all.
I would say one thing is we don't really incentivize, we don't give people a financial incentive to get the electric whatever, whether it's a scooter. There's really no kind of, I just find that people, the upfront cost, even though you might think like long-term, you're saving money over time, like an electric bike, for example, if you can't do the manual one, is really, really expensive. So I know that in the city council, we can't, give these tax breaks or these sorts of incentives, but I think it's an important part of the conversation. What the city can do is that we can make the infrastructure more conducive to planning for alternative transportation. So I think one of my first major bills was mandating that temporary supplemental bike lanes be created when an existing bike lane is disrupted by construction. That seems like a no-brainer, but it wasn't a law. And I remember being on First Avenue and having to kind of jet out right into First Avenue traffic. So that came from a constituent case that I myself experienced. I mentioned the streets master plan. That was supposed to be 150 miles of bus lanes, 250 miles of protected bike lanes. That's still an important initiative. And then my other intro that hasn't passed, which is 1812, which is the Office of Active Transportation. Everyone calls it very lovingly the bike mayor, but it's supposed to cover a bunch of things, addressing safety complaints from cyclists, making sure we're always keeping pedestrians as a priority, and then looking at other active transportation users. So those razors, those scooters, whatever it is, making sure that we're kind of creating this big network that accommodates everyone. And I'm also happy to see the electric scooter pilot in other in outer boroughs, I think it's critical that we connect all neighborhoods to these forms of transportation. I know Manhattan gets a lot of love, but we're certainly trying to look at other neighborhoods that just, historically haven't received the same set of resources. So we have to do that pretty smartly. And then as these neighborhoods, they convert, right, from formerly manufacturing to more residential, that's where we're seeing a lot of fatalities. I think that we have to start looking in some of those neighborhoods as well. So I think that's how we start as a city. And then, of course, looking at how we incentivize going towards those more electric fleets and those manual alternatives.
From my perspective, I can help beat the drum all day long with a council member around infrastructure, right? We can talk about that, have a whole separate panel about that. I mean, it's so clear around car culture, especially when you think about, I mean, the stats I've heard is, 3.5 million free car storage spots in New York City, right? So there's a lot to do there as you talk about encouraging other modes. I also think, if you're going to talk about making a dent in car culture, Car2Go in Brooklyn and Queens, Reach Now, which was BMW's car sharing network in Brooklyn and Queens, they're both gone. I used to use both. I'm a member of Zipcar. Zipcar used to be around $120, $130 a day. Now it's $200. So if you're gonna talk about car culture, I think we also need to work together, whether it's private companies like a Revel or a Car2Go or a Reach Now that already left, to make sure that there's a viable option for people to use that isn't $200 a day. So I think that's an important part of the conversation as well.
Yeah, and I think just building on that, I think part of the way we create a more sustainable city is by providing good alternatives. I think sometimes people think about it as drivers versus non-drivers, when I think the reality is there's a lot of people in New York City who don't own a car but use one from time to time for particular trips. And on the flip side, lots of people who do own a car but maybe would prefer not to use them for a lot of trips if they have good choices. So I don't think it's a flip the switch and the cars all disappear, but I think the more we can create alternatives, whether that's expanding car share, helping create the space on the street for that, whether it's continuing to build out the bike network, working with the MTA to make sure our bus system works well. Like just every time you make it easier to do something else, you disincentivize driving. And I think that we've done a lot in that respect, but there's obviously a lot more to do as well, and we want to keep working on that. And and then with the sort of big thing coming, also being the MTA's Central Business District tolling program, which both will provide some needed money for the MTA, but also will be just one more thing that will help discourage driving and encourage alternative transportation use. And I think as a city, we've been, it's obviously been disappointing how the current federal administration has delayed that, but we're excited and hopeful that we'll be able to move forward in the near future.
We are nearing the end of our time, so I'd like to actually two more quick questions. I do have one for Frank. I know that a lot of other private companies are hoping to enter the transportation market in New York. You've been here for 3 years now, I believe. What have you learned about working with city government, and where are the pitfalls there?
I think the advice I'd give to any other micromobility companies coming to the city, like the kick scooter permit that was mentioned before, I think it starts with just proactive outreach. So even in 2018, when I was, a guy with a PowerPoint deck, I was talking to Eric's team at the DOT. I was talking to Councilmember Reynoso and others in our Brooklyn pilot area. I was walking to police precincts to have a conversation with the commanding officer so that they knew when we launched what this was and how to enforce it, right? So even in 2018, we were on the ground, communication, making sure people aren't surprised. I think now that we're going to 2021, hopefully some of these companies understand that, and I think they do. I think another piece is after you get the permit, then there's how you act and how you operate after that. because getting the permit's great. But I think one of the reasons Revel has expanded to 7 markets across the country is that each of the markets we operate in, they vouch for me when we talk to another DOT in another market. They say, no, Revel's the real deal. And I think the third piece is, do not come to New York if you're using the gig economy. Nobody wants to. If you're gonna have somebody drive around a Toyota Camry, throwing kick scooters in the back of a car and charging in a multifamily apartment building, nobody wants to, right? So do not use the gig economy. Revel has not since we launched in 2018. Every single employee is an employee, has the same health insurance I do, not a health subsidy, not a small check to help pay for an HSA account, health insurance. What a crazy idea. So I would say if you come to New York, make sure you're actually hiring people.
I see how you won over the elected officials here. Good move. So, hey, this has been a great conversation. I just want to end with a final, walk through all 4 of you. And we barely talked about Vision Zero here. It's obviously an incredibly, wide array of ways to bring down traffic deaths. But I just want to ask each of you in 10 seconds. I mean, just give me one hit. What should New York be doing in the coming year to keep traffic fatalities as close to zero as possible? And I guess we'll start with Eric. Just one quick hit. What should New York City be doing?
I'll just say more. Like we have a successful toolbox. We know what we're doing, but we haven't gotten everywhere we want to get to. I think there's more to be done, but it's not it's not that we don't know what to do. It's just that we need to get out there and keep building the protected bike lanes and the safe streets and the speed cameras and really make sure these proven techniques get to every part of our city.
Thank you. Go down the line. Keith, what's one thing the city should do with Vision Zero next year?
Well, keep pushing on every front. Prioritize. We don't want people to lose their lives from pandemics, but we don't want people losing their lives in the streets either. So this is all about life safety. I'll leave you just one thought, which is we've been pushing on. If you try and buy a car, and maybe you should not have to choose between safety and luxury, right? Vehicle manufacturers are still selling vehicles, and they're bundling their high-end safety options with their high-end entertainment and extra options. So if I want automatic braking, I have to get a sunroof and an entertainment system. We really want to see everyone who's on this call and pushing the industry to separate safety and luxury so you can get the safest possible car without having to spend thousands of extra in frills. Thank you.
Thank you. And Frank, what about from you?
I mean, my mind immediately goes to the infrastructure piece. So I think policy is just going to be a big piece of this. So potentially something like anytime you repave a street, you're redesigning that street to make it safer. And that just happens. It's just baked into law.
And council member, from you, what's one thing the city can be doing to improve Vision Zero in the coming year?
I agree with all of my colleagues, especially in the infrastructure piece. I do think the outreach and education is going to be important. I think there are a lot of communities who utilize this very infrastructure we're talking about, and I'm just going to bring up the delivery workers one more time, who they're not really included in the conversation. So I think they're part of those communities that aren't really tapped into when we're talking about how to improve our city transportation-wise.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's participated in this conversation, the panelists and all of the attendees. Check out the chat on the side. We have a list of our sponsors to thank and also upcoming events. I'm not even sure if I'm the one that's supposed to be talking about this or Zach. I'm just going to say I will. So check out the chat. We have upcoming events. We have an upcoming event for anybody who lives in Queens where we're talking about various issues there. So that should be interesting. And with that, thanks to all of our panelists. And I think I'm going to turn it over to Zach briefly.
Thanks a lot, Jeff, for plugging our upcoming events. First, I want to thank all of our panelists, our beloved moderators and speakers. Great job, great conversation. So much going on with transportation and transit issues. But let's keep the conversation going on all the big issues affecting the state. Join us on Thursday, December 10th, for our next installment of our AARP sponsored webinar series, focused on Western and Central New York legislators. Registration is free, and as Jeff said, you can find out more information in the chat. We also got our Responsibility 100 celebration on December 16th, as well as our virtual legislators retreat on Tuesday, December 15th. So many incoming lawmakers coming into the state capitol. It'll be really great to learn about the issues that are coming up as budget season gets underway. Couldn't do any of this without our beloved sponsors like T-Mobile, Aptim, Cubic Transportation Systems, Data Siemens Mobility, of course, Boingo, Wireless, Revell, Transit Wireless, WSP Transportation, and the Bus for NYC Coalition. Thank you so much. Please join us again. You can always catch us at cityandstateny.com and subscribe to our newsletters, including Jeff's very good 2021 newsletter comes out every week. Thank you all, and we'll catch you next time.